The evening sun cast its final rays across the quiet suburban neighborhood as Darren Monroe pulled into his driveway. At 39, he had built what most would call an enviable life, a successful career, a cozy home, and a 10-year marriage to Emily, the woman he once believed was his soulmate. Yet something had shifted in the past year. It was subtle at first, her growing disinterest in shared activities, the increased time spent on her phone, and the frequent late-night errands. Tonight, as Darren climbed the porch steps, he noticed an Uber sticker on the car parked across the street. He dismissed it as unimportant, another vehicle waiting for a fare. But as he unlocked the door and entered the house, Emily's absence struck him again. Her excuses always rang hollow, and he had stopped asking questions. The soft ding of a notification on her abandoned tablet caught his attention, and for a moment, curiosity got the better of him. Darren hesitated, staring at the glowing screen before tapping to open the message. "Can't wait to see you again. Last night was unforgettable, Redheart." The sender's name was Greg Uber. Darren's stomach twisted. This couldn't be what it looked like. His fingers trembled as he opened the chat history. Messages revealed a sordid affair. Emily had been sneaking out, meeting Greg during Darren's late nights at work. Darren sat down heavily, the weight of betrayal crashing over him. Memories of their life together played in his mind, now tainted with suspicion. He felt the familiar pull of anger and sorrow, but another emotion slowly took hold, a cold, calculated determination. If Emily could shatter their bond so effortlessly, Darren would make her regret it. But not with an impulsive confrontation. No, this needed precision. That night, Darren didn't sleep. Instead, he planned. For weeks, he had tolerated her lies and her dismissiveness, but now the truth was exposed. He recalled her earlier dismissive remarks when he'd questioned her behavior. "You're just paranoid, Darren." Or, "Work's stressing you out." He even replayed their moments of intimacy, wondering how long she had worn her mask. By morning, Darren had his first move ready. He installed a small GPS tracker in her car and set up a hidden camera in the living room. He wanted evidence, not just for his sanity but to control the narrative when the time came. Days turned into weeks. Darren played the role of the loving, oblivious husband while monitoring Emily's activities. She left most nights under the guise of book club or girls' night. Each time, Greg's car was waiting for her a block away. One Friday, Darren decided to escalate his plan. After tracking her to a nearby motel, he followed discreetly, parking far enough away to avoid detection. Through a small gap in the curtains of room 215, he saw Emily laughing with Greg, sipping wine as if they were a couple with no cares in the world. The sight solidified his resolve. Back home, Darren pored over online forums and psychological resources, studying how stress and manipulation could affect someone's mental state. His plan crystallized. He wouldn't just expose her. He would dismantle her from within, piece by piece. Phase 1 began subtly. Darren started misplacing items Emily valued, her favorite earrings, her work badge, her diary. Each time, she became increasingly frustrated, accusing him of being careless or forgetful. "You're losing it, Em," Darren would reply, feigning concern. "Maybe you should see someone about this." Her confidence began to crack. Next came the noises. Darren set up a small Bluetooth speaker system that he could control remotely. Late at night, while Emily slept, he played faint whispers and creaking sounds just loud enough to wake her. "Did you hear that?" she'd ask, her eyes wide with fear. "Hear what?" Darren would respond, his tone laced with confusion. "Are you sure you're okay?" Each night, her sleep grew more restless. When Emily confided in her friends about the strange occurrences, Darren took it further. He changed the passwords on her social media accounts, sending cryptic messages to her friends. He even deleted conversations she cherished, making her doubt her memory. "You're acting so paranoid lately," Darren said one morning as Emily frantically searched for her phone. "Maybe you're just overwhelmed." "I'm not crazy," Emily snapped, but her voice betrayed uncertainty. By the third month of his campaign, Emily's once radiant confidence was a shadow of itself. Her carefully curated life began to unravel. She called in sick to work more frequently, avoided social gatherings, and barely glanced at her phone, a sharp contrast to her previous obsession. Then came the final straw. One evening, Darren accidentally left a printed email on the counter, a fake correspondence between Greg and a supposed ex-girlfriend, accusing him of manipulating women. Emily's face blanched as she read the lies Darren had fabricated. "Greg's been lying to me," she whispered, staring into space. Darren feigned surprise. "Maybe he's not who you think he is, Em. Sometimes the truth is staring us right in the face." As Emily spiraled deeper into paranoia, Darren watched, his satisfaction growing. Every day, she inched closer to the breaking point. This was only the beginning. Darren watched as Emily's paranoia took root. What had begun as small seeds of doubt now flourished into a garden of uncertainty. Every day, her eyes flicked toward corners of the house as if expecting something to jump out. At breakfast, she sat at the table, absent-mindedly stirring her coffee, her phone untouched beside her. This was unusual. Emily lived on that phone. "You okay?" Darren asked, sipping his coffee and keeping his tone light. Emily glanced up, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Just tired, I guess. Haven't been sleeping well. Maybe you should see someone," Darren suggested casually. "Stress can do strange things." Her eyes narrowed slightly, but she said nothing. Later that afternoon, Darren set the next stage in motion. He went to the basement, accessing the electrical panel. With a flick of a few switches, he cut power to random parts of the house. As expected, Emily's voice called out moments later. "Darren? Did you unplug something? The Wi-Fi's down again." He emerged from the basement, wiping his hands on a rag, his face the picture of confusion. "Huh. It's weird, isn't it? Maybe the router's faulty. It's the third time this week." Emily bit her lip, drumming her fingers on the kitchen counter. "I feel like... I don't know. It's like the house is playing tricks on me." Darren shrugged. "I'm sure it's nothing." But the doubt in her eyes lingered long after. That night, Darren prepared for his next move. While Emily was in the shower, he accessed her phone and installed a remote control app, one that allowed him to send random texts or delete messages without touching the device. The next morning, while Emily showered again, he deleted Greg's name from her contacts and replaced it with a random string of numbers. When she returned to the kitchen, phone in hand, she frowned. "Darren, do you know anything about this?" She held up the phone. "Greg's contact is gone. Look, his messages just say unknown number." Darren leaned over, furrowing his brow. "That's strange. Maybe your phone updated weirdly. It's not just Greg. A few of my friends' contacts are gone too." Darren's expression remained neutral, but inside, he reveled in the confusion blooming across her face. The next day, Emily woke up to find her jewelry scattered across the bathroom floor. Bracelets, necklaces, and earrings lay in a twisted heap, though she was certain she had left them neatly on the dresser the night before. She stormed into the kitchen, panic flashing in her eyes. "Did you touch my stuff last night?" Emily's voice trembled, but she tried to keep it steady. Darren looked up from his newspaper, arching a brow. "Why would I do that? It was all over the floor." She swallowed. "It's like someone..." He folded the paper with exaggerated care, meeting her gaze. "Emily, I think you're imagining things. Are you sure you didn't knock it over yourself?" "I didn't." Her voice cracked. "I'm not crazy, Darren. I didn't say you were." He reached across the table, resting his hand over hers. "But maybe you need a break. Why don't you take a few days off work? Relax a bit." She pulled her hand away and crossed her arms. "I can't just take time off because of a few misplaced earrings." Darren offered a calm smile. "Suit yourself." Over the next 2 weeks, Darren's plan accelerated. He altered small but noticeable things, swapping her shampoos, rearranging kitchen utensils, and changing the times on the microwave and oven by 10 minutes. When Emily mentioned it, he'd feign ignorance, or make her second-guess herself. You sure you're not just tired, Em? She eventually stopped bringing it up altogether. One night, as Darren worked late in his study, Emily paced the living room. She jumped at the sound of creaking floorboards. Her phone buzzed on the couch, drawing her attention. She picked it up, staring in confusion at the message. "I'm watching you," Darren observed quietly from the hallway, his shadow hidden in the dim light. He had sent the message from an anonymous burner app, watching as she locked the door and closed the curtains in panic. She rushed upstairs shortly after, locking the bedroom door behind her. The next morning, Darren knocked softly before entering the room. Emily sat on the edge of the bed, dark circles under her eyes. "You didn't sleep?" His voice was full of concern. "No." She looked at him, vulnerability replacing her usual confidence. "I don't know what's happening, Darren. I feel like I'm losing my mind." Darren knelt beside her, brushing the hair from her face. "Maybe it's work. You've been under a lot of pressure." She exhaled deeply, nodding. "Maybe. Why don't you spend the weekend at your sister's place? Clear your head." Emily hesitated but eventually agreed. While she was gone, Darren deepened his manipulation. He moved family photos, hid mail, and even removed small appliances. When she returned, the subtle changes unsettled her further. "Where's the toaster?" Emily asked, glancing around the kitchen. "Toaster's right where it always is," Darren replied without looking up. She stared at him for a long moment before shaking her head. That night, Darren caught her searching through drawers and cupboards, her frustration evident. "What are you looking for?" he asked from the doorway. I don't know," she muttered. Darren leaned against the frame, arms crossed. "Emily, you're not yourself lately." She ran her hands over her face, exhaling sharply. By the end of the second month, Emily barely left the house. Her once lively, outgoing personality had eroded into isolation and doubt. She avoided friends and turned down invitations, convinced someone was out to get her. Darren watched in satisfaction as the vibrant woman he had married unraveled, one thread at a time. But he wasn't done yet. This was only the prelude to the real destruction. The cracks in Emily's sanity were no longer subtle. Darren watched her slip further into paranoia with each passing day. By now, she had stopped bringing up the strange occurrences around the house. Whenever he asked why she seemed distant, she'd shake her head with a dismissive, "I'm fine." But her trembling hands betrayed her. Darren's heart rate quickened with each success. It wasn't about revenge anymore, it was about control. One evening, Darren left his laptop open on the kitchen table. On the screen was a webpage titled, "Early Symptoms of Paranoia and Schizophrenia." He had no intention of bringing it up, but he knew Emily wouldn't resist reading it. Sure enough, when he returned from a quick trip to the store, he found her staring at the screen, a crease between her brows. She didn't notice him at first. "Emily?" he said softly, pretending to startle at her wide-eyed gaze. "You okay?" She minimized the window with shaking fingers. I thought it was something for work." "What is this?" Darren leaned over the table, playing the part of a concerned but confused husband. "Oh, I was just reading something earlier. It's nothing, really." Her eyes lingered on the screen before she closed the laptop. "I need to lie down." Darren kissed her on the forehead. "I'll take care of dinner tonight. Get some rest." As she disappeared upstairs, he smiled to himself. That night, Darren activated the Bluetooth speakers again, this time playing faint scratching sounds in the walls near their bedroom. Emily woke him twice, insisting there was something in the walls. Each time, Darren inspected the area with a flashlight, shaking his head. "I don't see anything. You probably just imagined it." "I know what I heard," she snapped. But Darren had patience. "Maybe call someone tomorrow. Just to check, for your peace of mind." Her eyes flicked around the dark hallway as if something lurked just beyond their view. She didn't sleep. Phase 2, isolation. Emily's friends were the next target. Darren started small. Using Emily's phone while she was in the shower, he sent cold and dismissive texts to her closest friends. When they responded with concern, he deleted the messages before Emily could see them. When one friend, Lisa, called the house, Darren answered. "She's been feeling a little off lately," Darren confided, his voice heavy with false concern. "I think she's just stressed. She doesn't really want to talk." Lisa sounded unconvinced but said she'd check in again later. Emily never found out about the call. Over the following days, Darren repeated this process with others, subtly pushing them away, one by one. Soon, the phone stopped ringing altogether. One evening, Emily sat curled up on the couch, scrolling through her messages. Her expression twisted as she stared at her nearly empty inbox. "No one's responding to me," she muttered. "Maybe they're just busy," Darren offered from across the room. "It happens." She nodded absently, but Darren knew the seed of doubt had been planted. The next morning, he overheard Emily trying to call Lisa again. The line rang out unanswered. Darren had blocked her number days ago. It wasn't long before Emily's world shrank to the confines of their house. She quit her yoga classes, stopped going for coffee with her coworkers. Eventually, she even began calling in sick to work. "I just don't feel up to it," she told Darren, bundled up on the couch under a blanket. He nodded sympathetically. "You need to take care of yourself. Your health comes first." Phase 3, planting doubt about Greg. Darren crafted fake emails from Greg, ones Emily would find by accident. One email, supposedly from Greg to a friend, read, "I've been stringing her along, but she's starting to get clingy. Honestly, I don't know how long I can keep this up. Might have to cut it off soon." Darren printed the email and left it folded in the drawer by Emily's makeup. Later that day, as she got ready, Darren lingered by the door, waiting for the sound of rustling paper. He heard her breath catch in her throat. Seconds later, she stormed downstairs, paper trembling in her hands. "What the hell is this?" she demanded, shoving the paper in Darren's face. He squinted at it, pretending to read. "Where did you find this?" "In my drawer." "Why is Greg saying these things?" Her voice cracked with panic. Darren took the paper and set it aside calmly. "Maybe you should ask him. I don't know what's going on between you two." Emily's hands twisted together. Later that night, Darren overheard her crying in the bathroom. The final blow came a week later. While Emily was out, Darren left an anonymous letter in their mailbox, written in messy, scrawled handwriting. It read, "I know about you and the Uber driver. Everyone knows. You're disgusting." Darren made sure to place it halfway down the pile of mail, knowing she would find it when she sorted through the bills. That evening, Darren returned home to find Emily pacing, clutching the letter. She looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes. "Someone knows, Darren? Someone knows about Greg." Darren frowned, taking the paper from her. This is sick. Who would do this?" Emily wrapped her arms around herself, trembling. "I don't know, but I feel like I'm being watched. Every time I leave the house, I feel like someone's staring at me." Darren gently pulled her into his chest, stroking her hair. "You're safe here. No one's going to hurt you." But his eyes held no warmth as he glanced over her shoulder. He was far from done. Emily wasn't just losing her mind. Darren would make sure she lost everything. The change in Emily became impossible to ignore. By now, she barely left the house. Her once pristine appearance, perfectly done hair, tailored clothes, gave way to baggy sweaters and dark circles beneath her eyes. She paced rooms aimlessly, mumbling to herself. Darren would catch her staring out the window, jumping at shadows that weren't there. It was working. But he couldn't stop now. She hadn't broken yet, not completely. One evening, Darren set the trap for the next stage. Before bed, he adjusted the thermostat, cranking the heat to an unbearable level. Then, while Emily showered, he turned it back down to freezing. In the dead of night, Emily woke up shivering, tossing the blankets aside. "Darren, the heat's not working." Her voice was soft, tinged with exhaustion. Darren stirred, feigning grogginess. "Feels fine to me." He rubbed his arms under the covers for effect. "It's freezing in here." She sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing her bare feet. "I'll take a look at it in the morning." But Darren knew that by morning, the thermostat would mysteriously return to normal. The following week, Darren left a half-empty wine glass in the middle of the kitchen counter, something he knew Emily hadn't touched. She found it later that night. "Did you leave this here?" she asked, holding it up as he sat on the couch. He glanced over with mild interest. "I didn't pour any wine tonight." Her brows furrowed. "I'm sure you just forgot," Darren added nonchalantly. Emily's grip on the glass tightened. "I didn't forget. I didn't even open a bottle. Maybe you did and don't remember." Her eyes narrowed, and Darren watched as the flicker of doubt spread across her face. The next day, Darren stepped it up further. He logged into her Facebook account, still knowing the password, and posted a cryptic status update. "Sometimes I feel like someone is following me." Minutes later, he deleted it. When Emily logged in, she found concerned messages from friends asking if she was okay. "What the hell?" Emily muttered, scrolling through her inbox. Darren watched quietly from the doorway, listening to her confused murmurs. She clicked through her account settings, trying to find an explanation. But by then, Darren had already erased the activity log. Her paranoia grew stronger. 2 nights later, he took it to another level. Darren waited until Emily fell asleep, then placed her keys in the refrigerator. In the morning, she tore the house apart, muttering curses under her breath. When Darren woke, he found her sitting at the kitchen table, the keys in front of her. They were in the fridge. Her voice was small, fragile. Darren arched a brow. "Why would you put them there?" "I didn't." She rubbed her temples. "Well, they didn't get there on their own." Her head dropped into her hands. "Maybe I need to see someone, maybe I really am losing it." Darren sat down beside her, offering what appeared to be genuine sympathy. "Hey, it's okay. Everyone goes through rough patches. I can call Dr. Sanders, get you an appointment." Emily's hands trembled against her lap. "I think that's a good idea." Inside, Darren felt the rush of victory. But there was still more work to do. One evening, Darren left his phone unlocked on the couch. Emily sat across the room, flipping channels mindlessly. When she glanced at his phone, Darren ensured that the screen showed an incoming call from Greg. Of course, it wasn't really Greg. It was a second phone Darren had purchased weeks ago. Emily stiffened, watching as the call rang out unanswered. "Who's Greg?" she asked, her voice sharp. Darren looked up, pretending not to hear. "What?" She pointed at his phone. "Greg. Why is he calling you?" Darren's eyes widened with false confusion. "Greg? Isn't that the name of that Uber driver you mentioned once?" Emily's lips parted, but no words came out. Darren took the phone, scrolling through the call logs. "Weird. Must be a scam. I don't know any Greg." Her eyes lingered on him, doubt flickering behind them. Darren left the room, knowing she wouldn't sleep that night. The next day, Darren upped the ante again. As Emily napped in the afternoon, Darren unlocked the back door and left it slightly ajar. When she woke, she immediately noticed the chill seeping into the house. She found Darren in the garage. "The back door was open," she said, her voice shaking. "Did you leave it like that?" Darren frowned. "No. I locked up last night." Her hands tightened around the edges of her sweater. "Someone was in the house, Darren." He stepped closer, placing his hands on her shoulders. "I think you're imagining things, Em. Nothing's missing." "I'm not imagining it," she snapped. Darren nodded sympathetically. I know, but I think you're under too much stress. It's affecting your memory." She stared up at him, silent. "Let me install some cameras. If someone's messing with us, we'll catch them." She agreed instantly, desperate for any form of reassurance. What Emily didn't know was that Darren had already installed cameras, hidden ones, not for security, but to monitor her unraveling. A week later, Darren took one last step to push her over the edge. He left a sticky note on her bathroom mirror in shaky, childlike handwriting. It read, "I see you when you sleep. Emily found it the next morning. Darren pretended to be as shocked as she was. I don't understand, Emily whispered, clutching the note. Who could have done this? Darren gently took the paper from her. I think it's time to call someone. Maybe stay at your mom's for a while. Emily nodded numbly. She was barely holding on. And Darren was about to break the last thread. Emily's eyes darted around the house like a hunted animal. Every creak in the floorboards, every hum from the refrigerator made her flinch. Darren had watched her unravel for weeks, but now she was on the edge. She barely ate. Sleep came only in brief, restless intervals. And the bags under her eyes grew darker with each passing day. Darren sat across from her at breakfast, spreading butter across his toast as if nothing was wrong. Emily, on the other hand, merely pushed scrambled eggs around her plate. I called Dr. Sanders, Darren said casually, not looking up. He can see you tomorrow at noon. Emily didn't respond. She kept staring at her fork, her hand trembling faintly. Her head snapped up, eyes wide. Yeah, sorry. That's fine. He took a slow sip of his coffee, studying her over the rim. She was fragile now. One good push, and she'd shatter completely. That afternoon, Darren took the next step in his plan. While Emily was at the store, finally coaxed out of the house after his insistence, Darren accessed the smart speaker in the living room. He programmed it to turn on randomly throughout the night, playing distorted whispers. I see you, leave now, you're not safe. The volume was low, barely more than a murmur, but just loud enough to bleed through the walls when the house was silent. That night Darren waited. At 3:14 a.m., the first whisper echoed softly through the house. Darren stirred, pretending to wake groggily. Emily sat upright in bed, clutching the sheets to her chest. Her breath was shallow, eyes locked on the dark hallway outside their room. Did you hear that? She whispered. Darren sat up slowly, blinking in faint confusion. Hear what? She stared at him, her lips trembling. There's someone in the house. Darren swung his legs over the bed, grabbing the flashlight from the nightstand. Stay here. I'll check it out. Emily gripped his arm tightly. No. Don't go out there. He placed his hand over hers, offering a soft smile. It's okay, Em. I'll handle it. As he swept through the house with the flashlight, Darren made sure to let the beam linger on empty corners, shadows stretched across the walls in strange shapes. He knew she was watching from the bedroom door, biting her nails nervously. After 10 minutes he returned. Nothing. He shrugged. House is locked up tight. Emily's expression didn't relax. It was probably just the wind, Darren suggested, guiding her gently back to bed. You're overthinking things again. But Emily didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next day, Darren left a crumpled Polaroid photo on the living room floor. It was a picture of Emily, taken weeks ago while she slept. She found it while vacuuming. Her scream echoed through the house. Darren rushed in, feigning panic. What happened? Emily shoved the photo into his hands, eyes wild. This? Who took this? He stared at the photo with furrowed brows, turning it over as if searching for an answer. Where did you find this? It was just lying there. Darren, someone was in our house. His calm demeanor contrasted her hysteria. Em, I don't think. I'm not crazy, she snapped, her voice cracking. Darren exhaled, placing a hand on her shoulder. I believe you, but there's no sign of a break-in. Her knees buckled slightly, and she sank onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. Darren knelt beside her. Look, why don't we get away for a bit? We could take a vacation, just you and me. Somewhere quiet. You need to rest. Emily shook her head. No. I can't leave. What if he comes back? Darren leaned closer, lowering his voice to a soothing murmur. I'll protect you. But you can't live like this. It's not healthy. Her eyes softened for a moment, but the fear never fully left. Later that evening, Darren retrieved an old hoodie he no longer wore. He doused it in Emily's perfume, crumpled it, and tossed it into the bushes near the back door. The next morning, as she sipped coffee in the kitchen, Darren, accidentally, glanced out the window. Come here. She set the cup down carefully and joined him by the window. What is that? He asked, pointing toward the hoodie partially hidden in the bushes. Emily's eyes widened in horror. Is that mine? Her voice wavered. Darren nodded slowly, narrowing his eyes. Looks like it. I didn't put it there, Darren. His jaw tightened in mock seriousness. I believe you. They stared at the hoodie in silence for a long moment. Darren eventually stepped outside, retrieving it with a stick as if it were a venomous snake. He brought it back inside, setting it down on the counter. Maybe someone's messing with us, he said. A prank or something. No one would do that, Emily whispered. Darren exhaled deeply, rubbing the back of his neck. Maybe we should call the police. Emily's head snapped up. No! What if they think I'm making it up? Darren paused, pretending to consider it. You're right. Let's just stay calm. I'll keep an eye out. She nodded, but Darren noticed the way her hands trembled as she clutched the edge of the counter. A week later, Darren took it one step further. He left a muddy footprint, large, deliberate, leading from the back porch to the window outside their bedroom. That night, as Emily prepared for bed, she spotted it. Her scream pierced the house, and Darren came running. She pointed to the footprint, tears streaming down her face. He was here! He was watching us, Darren. Darren knelt, inspecting the footprint closely. It's fresh, he muttered. I'll check the security cameras. He made a show of reviewing the footage, shaking his head. Nothing's there. No one showed up. Emily backed away from the window, trembling uncontrollably. We're not safe, she whispered. Darren wrapped his arms around her. I won't let anything happen to you. But deep down, he knew, Emily was already slipping beyond the point of return. Emily no longer trusted the walls around her. The house, their sanctuary, felt like a trap, every shadow pressing down on her like unseen hands. Darren watched her with quiet satisfaction, knowing her breaking point was near. She hadn't left the house in days. Even sunlight spilling through the curtains seemed menacing to her now. Darren noticed the way she moved, hesitant, cautious, as if something lurked just behind her shoulder. Perfect. One afternoon, Darren, accidentally, left a handwritten note in the glove compartment of Emily's car. I see you. I've always seen you. The handwriting was sloppy, hurried, disguised enough not to resemble his own. Hours later, Emily stormed inside, the note clutched in her shaking hand. Darren! She shouted. Come here. Now. Darren set his phone down and walked into the kitchen. What's wrong? Her chest heaved as she slapped the note down on the table. Did you put this in my car? He frowned, picking it up and scanning the words. What is this? You tell me. I found it when I went to grab groceries. Someone's been in my car. Darren placed the note down carefully, concern deepening the lines in his forehead. Emily, this is getting serious. She ran both hands through her hair, pacing across the kitchen. I know that. This isn't just stress. Someone's following me. Darren crossed his arms, leaning against the counter. Okay, then we need to talk to someone. A therapist, maybe even the police. No! Emily's head snapped toward him, panic flaring in her eyes. They won't believe me. Darren's expression softened, and he placed his hands on her shoulders. I believe you, he whispered. Emily broke down into silent sobs against his chest. Darren held her, stroking her hair. He could feel her bones beneath his fingertips. She'd been eating less, sleeping even less. Good. Later that night, Darren moved on to the next step. While Emily was asleep, he unlocked the front door and left it slightly ajar, allowing the cool night air to creep inside. At exactly 2:30 a.m., Darren gently shook Emily awake. Wake up. She stirred, eyes fluttering open. What? The front door's open, Darren said softly. I think someone came inside. Emily bolted upright, pulling the covers around herself. What do you mean open? Darren stood, grabbing the baseball bat he had placed beside the nightstand. I'm going to check the house. Stay here. Emily's eyes darted around the room, her hands gripping the edge of the bed so tightly that her knuckles whitened. Darren swept through the house, purposely letting the floorboards creak beneath his weight. Every sound echoed back to the bedroom. When he returned, Darren placed the bat down with exaggerated care. Nothing. I checked every room. Emily's legs hung over the side of the bed, bouncing slightly as she rubbed her arms nervously. Darren, I swear I locked it before bed. I believe you. Darren crouched down, resting his hand over hers. But maybe you forgot. Or maybe you didn't. Either way, I'm going to double-check the locks every night. Her breathing slowed, but she didn't relax. Darren watched as she wrapped herself in the blanket, curling into the smallest space she could make. Her vulnerability made him feel alive. 3 nights later, Darren left muddy handprints on the outside of the bedroom window. Emily didn't find them until morning. Her scream shattered the quiet hum of breakfast. Darren rushed into the kitchen, wiping his hands on a towel. What happened? Emily pointed toward the window with trembling fingers. Look! He squinted through the glass. 4 long streaks ran down the pane, just the right height for someone standing outside. Darren placed his hand over the marks, frowning. They're too big to be yours, he muttered. I know, Emily whispered. I'll set up motion lights tonight. It's probably just kids messing around. No. Emily shook her head violently. This isn't kids. It's him. He's been watching me, Darren. I can feel it. Darren's eyes darkened as he glanced at her. Then let's take you to stay with your sister for a while. Emily's face twisted in conflict. I don't want to leave, she mumbled. You need to, Darren pressed gently. This isn't good for you. You're not sleeping. This isn't healthy. She didn't respond. That night, Emily lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, her fingers tapping a rhythmic beat against her thigh. By the following week, she had stopped functioning altogether. Darren came home to find her sitting on the couch, still wearing the clothes from the day before. Her hair was unbrushed, and her skin pale. Darren set his keys down, approaching her carefully. She didn't look at him, just kept staring at the dark TV screen as if she could see something no one else could. I called Dr. Sanders again, Darren said softly, crouching beside her. You missed your appointment. I forgot, she whispered. Darren lifted her chin gently. We need to get you help, Em. Tears welled up in her eyes. I don't know what's happening to me. He brushed a lock of hair behind her ear, offering a small smile. I do. You've been under too much stress. Her gaze flickered over his face, searching for reassurance. I'll take care of everything, Darren continued. We'll figure this out together. Emily nodded faintly, the fight draining from her completely. And just like that, Darren knew she was his to mold. Emily drifted through the house like a ghost. She rarely spoke now, only moving from the bedroom to the couch in slow, deliberate steps. Darren pretended to be the doting husband, bringing her tea, drawing the curtains, and murmuring soft reassurances as she stared blankly at the walls. But inside, he savored every moment of her unraveling. She was almost gone. That night, Darren set the stage for the final blow. At 4 a.m., he slipped out of bed and crept downstairs. He opened the back door just wide enough to trigger the alarm but carefully silenced the system before it blared. Then, he left one muddy footprint in the hallway. By the time Emily stirred and noticed the door ajar, Darren was already sitting at the kitchen table, rubbing his temples as if he'd been awake for hours. She found him there, eyes darting toward the open door. Darren? Her voice trembled. He turned slowly, glancing toward the door. I heard something around 3. He lied, running a hand through his hair. I checked outside, but I didn't see anyone. Her gaze fixed on the single footprint. That wasn't there before, she whispered. Darren stood, his face twisted into a mask of concern. I know. I thought maybe it was mine, but I didn't come inside with muddy shoes. Emily backed away from the footprint as if it might lunge at her. Darren, someone was in the house. He wrapped his arms around her before she could finish, gently guiding her toward the couch. It's okay. I'm calling a locksmith. We'll change the locks today. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her fingers digging into his arm. It's not just the locks, Darren. It's everything. I feel like I'm being watched constantly. He nodded, pulling her closer. I know, Em. You're not crazy. Her tears soaked into his shirt as she clung to him like a child. But he wasn't finished yet. Later that afternoon, Darren arranged for the locksmith to come while Emily lay resting upstairs. The new locks were a formality. There was never any real intruder. After the locksmith left, Darren placed the crumpled photograph of Emily in the mailbox. It was the same Polaroid he had left weeks ago, but this time, he scrawled on the back in jagged letters. I'm closer than you think. He left it for Emily to find. The next morning, Darren sat at the kitchen table sipping his coffee as Emily shuffled in, her hands trembling as she tossed the photo onto the table. She didn't say a word, just stared at him, waiting for his reaction. He picked up the photo, turning it over slowly. His brow furrowed. Where did this come from? The mailbox, she croaked. Darren leaned forward, eyes locked on hers. Emily, this isn't normal. I think it's time we consider something more serious. Maybe even the hospital. Her breathing quickened. You think I need to be locked away? Darren sighed deeply, setting the photo aside. It's not about being locked away. It's about safety. Yours and mine. Emily pressed her hands to her head. I can't stay here, Darren. I just can't. Then let's go, he said softly. Your sister's a hotel, anywhere you feel safe. She glanced toward the window, staring out at the empty street. No, she whispered. The hospital. Darren's heart pounded at the words. Are you sure? Emily nodded. The next day, Darren drove Emily to a private psychiatric hospital on the outskirts of town. The intake was quiet and sterile, no scenes, no protests. Emily simply signed the forms with shaking hands. As Darren watched her disappear down the hall, escorted by a nurse, he felt nothing but cold satisfaction. It was done. 1 week later, Darren sat in his darkened living room, sipping whiskey in silence. The house was still, Emily's absence settling over it like a thick fog. His phone buzzed on the table. It was the hospital. Mr. Monroe. The doctor's voice was gentle but firm. Your wife is asking for you. She's not well. Emily's convinced someone is still following her inside the hospital. We think it might help if you visited. Darren swirled the amber liquid in his glass, staring at the fading footprint near the front door, the last remnant of his careful manipulation. I'll come by tomorrow, he replied calmly. As he hung up, Darren leaned back in his chair and exhaled deeply. Emily was exactly where she needed to be. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and quiet desperation. Darren walked through the front doors with slow, measured steps, the weight of victory settling over him like a warm coat. Emily had been in the psychiatric ward for 2 weeks now. The doctors called it a temporary admission, but Darren knew better. She wouldn't be coming home. And that was the plan all along. A nurse escorted Darren down the hall, her soft footsteps echoing faintly against the polished floor. She's been withdrawn, the nurse explained in hushed tones. Paranoia seems to be the primary issue. She keeps insisting someone is watching her through the windows, even though we've reassured her countless times. Darren nodded thoughtfully. It's been hard for her, he replied, masking his satisfaction with well-practiced concern. The nurse hesitated at the door to Emily's room. Just be gentle with her. She's fragile right now. Darren forced a sympathetic smile. I always am. Emily was sitting by the window when Darren entered. She didn't turn to greet him. Her thin frame was illuminated by the dull gray light outside, and the way her shoulders sagged made her look smaller than he remembered. Hey, Em, Darren said softly, pulling up a chair beside her. Her eyes shifted slightly, but she didn't meet his gaze. You came, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Of course I did. Darren leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. How are you feeling? She didn't answer right away. Her pale fingers picked at the fabric of the hospital-issued blanket draped over her lap. There's someone outside, she murmured after a long silence. I see him at night. Just standing there. Darren glanced at the window. Beyond the glass, the hospital grounds stretched into a neat garden, and further still, the fence that separated the hospital from the road. There was no one there. There's nobody outside. Her head snapped toward him, and for the first time in weeks, Darren saw something familiar flicker behind her eyes, defiance. I'm not making it up, she hissed, her voice trembling. He watches me. Just like he did at the house. You didn't believe me then, but it's real, Darren. I know it. Darren reached out, covering her hand with his own. She stiffened under his touch but didn't pull away. I believe you, he lied, his voice dripping with reassurance. Emily searched his face, her lip trembling. No, you don't, she whispered. Darren sighed, letting his shoulders sag dramatically. Emily, you're safe here. Nobody's following you. The doctor said this kind of thing happens sometimes, when people are overwhelmed. It's part of the healing process. Her eyes narrowed. What did I do to deserve this? Darren froze for half a second, catching himself before his expression slipped. What are you talking about? Emily turned her gaze back to the window, her reflection faint and fragile in the glass. You wanted me gone, she muttered. I don't know why, but I can feel it. Every time you looked at me, something was different. I thought it was stress, but it wasn't. Darren's stomach twisted, but outwardly, he remained calm. That's not true, he said softly, gently brushing his thumb over the back of her hand. You've been through a lot, Em. It's hard to see things clearly when your mind is racing. For a moment, she didn't respond. The room felt colder somehow, and Darren's grip tightened over her hand instinctively. You're the one who left the door open, aren't you? Emily's voice broke the silence like a blade slicing through glass. Darren's pulse quickened. What? Her eyes shifted to meet his, and for the first time, Darren saw something terrifying, certainty. You did it, she continued, voice trembling but sure. The notes. The footprints. The everything. It was you. Darren opened his mouth, ready to deny it, but the words stuck in his throat. Emily's breathing grew shallow, and her body began to shake as if the realization was unraveling something deep within her. I thought I was going crazy, she said, tears brimming in her eyes. But it wasn't me. It was you all along. Emily. Darren's tone shifted, more forceful now. You need to calm down. You're imagining things again. Her eyes flashed with a rare moment of clarity. Get out, she whispered. What? Get out. Emily's voice cracked, but it grew louder. I don't want to see you. The nurse appeared at the door almost instantly, drawn by the sudden commotion. Mr. Monroe, I think it's best if you step outside, she said, her tone polite but firm. Darren hesitated, glancing between Emily and the nurse. Emily's eyes never left him, burning with a fire he hadn't seen in weeks. He rose slowly, nodding to the nurse before stepping into the hallway. As the door clicked shut behind him, Darren let out a slow breath. She knew. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. In the days that followed, Emily's condition worsened. She refused Darren's visits, growing more withdrawn and erratic. The doctor suggested long-term care. Darren agreed without hesitation. One cold, gray afternoon, Darren stood at the kitchen window of their empty house, watching the wind sweep leaves across the driveway. The home felt quieter without Emily's presence, but that suited him just fine. A single envelope lay unopened on the counter, the hospital's latest update on Emily's condition. Darren didn't bother reading it. He had one. And as he sipped his coffee, Darren smiled to himself. Some victories didn't need celebrations. Just silence.